Well, welcome back to our first 2019 edition of CityLine, and joining me now is the Government Relations Officer for the City of Tacoma, Randall Lewis. And Randy, just a new year starting out once again, and we welcome you to CityLine.
Well, thank you. Good to be here, and I like to use the other set, instead of the Inside Tacoma set once in a while too. That's great.
That's right. You're normally the host of Inside Tacoma, so welcome to the comfy couch.
Thank you.
So now, for our viewers at home that don't maybe understand or know much about what the Government Relations Officer or the Government Relations Office of the City of Tacoma does, can you give us a little insight into that?
Well, we're the folks. I think it says formally in the written document somewhere that we represent the city before the regional, state, federal, and tribal governments in the United States. So our office is usually the point on working with the state legislature, Congress, the federal administration, the state administration, tribal government, and a lot of various regional governments, counties, other cities, and things like that. Now, that's not to say that other departments of the city interact with all those other governments at the detail level all the time, but when it comes to like representing the city council's policy views on various issues, that's where the Government Relations Office gets involved.
Sure. Now, just from an experience level, how long have you been doing this?
I have been the City of Tacoma's Government Relations Officer for 28 years.
28, awesome.
And before that, I was actually a City Hall reporter in one of my earlier careers. When the city first moved from the County City building to the municipal building, I was the City Hall reporter for a now defunct AM radio station.
All right. A lot of quality history there.
Yeah.
So now, as we jump into 2019, whether you're into politics or not, it's at the forefront of many discussions around the water cooler and on the TV and the radio. And first of all, coming up here, we will focus on the state. And down in Olympia, obviously, we have our state government and Governor Inslee. And tell us a little bit about the length of this session and what the main topics of interest are coming up in this session.
Right. Well, the legislature will convene later in January for a 105-day session. In the odd-numbered years, they do 105 days. And the one thing I think we can pretty much guarantee is that with the larger Democratic majorities in both the House and Senate, we will actually see them end on time. We won't have an extended legislative session in 2019. And that was the result of the election in 2018, where we've had the Democrats took control of the Senate in 2018 in a special election. And now they've extended that majority there. There was a one-vote majority in the House as well, and that's been extended. Democratic governor, so Washington is a Democratic-controlled state. Whether you like that or not, personally, it does make it easier for legislators to get things done. Bipartisanship is a great thing when it works, and it doesn't always work. So one-party control. I've been doing this for 28 years. We've had the Republicans in control of everything, except the governor's office, which they haven't had. We haven't had a Republican governor since John Spellman, but it's been some time. But there has been Republican legislative bodies, and whether you have one-party control or split control, you can always still get things done. It just depends on what the politics are going to be and how you have to maneuver around it to cover things like the city's agenda, which is usually pretty bipartisan. We don't have, the city council adopts an agenda. It's not really a Democratic agenda or a Republican agenda. It's the city council's agenda, and they're nonpartisan offices, and there's always Republicans and Democrats who are interested in helping local government solve problems. Different legislators focus on different kinds of problems, but there's always a way to get something done in Olympia, regardless of who controls it. It's just the one thing that happens when you have unified control is you probably end the sessions on time, and that's a good thing too.
Now you give updates, government relations updates at the study sessions on a fairly regular basis.
Right.
Do those increase during the session?
Yes,
Or not?
we have done this in the past where we've kind of gone every few weeks to the city council, kind of give them an update about the progress of their agenda. They adopted an agenda in December for both the state and federal governments, and the things they really want my office to look at and kind of, in the case of the state in particular, it's things that probably wouldn't happen in Olympia unless we bring those issues forward. And so that's what the city's agenda is focused on. And we kind of update them on how much progress or lack of progress we're having on those issues.
Sure. So, what would you say the top 5 or 6 items are that are on the city agenda right now?
The city's agenda for the state is focused on a couple of areas. One is funding for affordable housing and homelessness. Those are kind of linked issues. And Tacoma is not unique in seeking some state assistance in that area, both money as well as some regulatory changes that would make it a little easier to deal with some of those problems. So there have been a lot of meetings in the later half of 2018 with local governments and other advocates for homelessness and affordable housing, financing folks, builders, a whole lot of folks getting together, figuring out ways to move forward on this issue to help address homelessness and affordable housing in our region. We know there will be bills introduced as a result of a lot of those discussions. We're going to introduce a couple of our own to the policy discussion. So that's probably number one on the list. There's also some transportation issues. There's a very good likelihood the legislature will adopt some kind of a revenue package for transportation in 2019. Not as big as the one they did a few years ago, the Connecting Washington package, which was a 13.5-cent gas tax increase. This will be something smaller. But there's some critical needs that just aren't funded with that Connecting Washington package. And there's one example that most anybody in Tacoma can readily see, and that's the Puyallup River Bridge, or Puyallup Avenue, the bridge that's currently closed that connects Tacoma with Fife on the old Highway 99 corridor. Right now that's closed because the city got some grant money to fix one portion of that bridge, and that will reopen sometime in 2019. That new portion will connect to the old bridge, which was weight limited and restricted, and still needs badly to be replaced, and could be closed because of structural problems at any time. That's about another $90 to $100 million project to replace the rest of that bridge, and there's just no money available for projects like that. Heavily used bridges that are just past their obsolescence date.
Right.
So there's a lot of those kind of bridges in Washington. I guess that's the good thing. There's a lot of bridges like the Puyallup River Bridge. So there is a lot of legislative interest in looking at that. And we do have one advantage right now, and that is that the 27th district's, one of the two representatives from the 27th district, which represents a large portion of Tacoma, is Representative Jake Fye, former Tacoma City Council member. He's just been elected chairman of the Transportation Committee in the House. Now, that doesn't mean he's just going to funnel money to his district. You have to have a statewide responsibility when you're the chair.
Right.
But it is, it is easier to get his attention about something that he's very, very familiar with, and that is that Puyallup River Bridge.
Sure. Now, as we get closer to the session, is there more communication between you and our lobbyists and our legislators?
Yes, we'll be communicating with them regularly via attendance at hearings, providing some testimony ourselves, though that's really not the preference, is to have the lobbyist sit in front of the legislature. Much rather have an elected official like our council or mayor there, or even better yet, a citizen who's affected by some particular legislation who wants to come down and who happens to share the city's view on that issue. That's even the best kind of testimony to provide to legislators. So we'll be doing that kind of communications, plus just the regular walking the halls and talking to members as you can find them, trying to get to meetings with them. That normal kind of communication, a lot of email, a lot of notes passing at the door when they're on the floor, that kind of normal legislative process that citizens can see if they go down to visit the Capitol and watch all those lobbyists buzzing around.
Sure. So it's more about, communication and alerting people to the needs and
Right.
and the hopes going forward.
Right, and then legislators reciprocate. I mean, there's information coming from members that say, okay, in order to push this issue you've got, I need your help with this.
Sure.
Can you get me an answer to this question, or can you have 3 people testify at this hearing? So there's a lot of that back and forth with, that's kind of the role lobbyists play.
Right, right. Well, if you got a few moments, we'd like to ask you to stay for another segment, because we have much more to talk about here if you're open to that idea.
Sure.
All right. Well, stay with us. We'll be back with more with Government Relations Officer Randy Lewis. Stay with us, please.
Because we need more places where we can dream.
Where kids can be kids.
To get air in our lungs.
To grow our food.
Because we need to share the stories of our favorite places.
Help the Trust for Public Land protect open spaces by sharing why nature matters to you.
The Trust for My Land.
For our land.
The Trust for Public Land.
Everybody has a dream. Mine was to see the ocean. And with a little help, I made it.
Tacoma Pierce County Crime Stoppers.
Officials are hoping that you can help solve 2 homicides that occurred in 2018. The first is the murder of 41-year-old Ginger Gover, whose body was found in a warehouse in Puyallup. The second is the death of Joanne Boyer, who was killed in her home from a shot that was fired outside.
Earn up to $1,000. Remain anonymous. We need your help. Crime Stoppers.
I can't go on without you. I can't go on without you, oh Lord. Go on without you. I can't go on without you, baby. Oh, so what is left but a broken man, 'cause nothing hurts like you can.
Welcome back to CityLine, this 2019 first edition, and joining us, Randy Lewis from the Government Relations Office. And Randy, as we finish up here on the state government, we're listening to the radio this morning and heard some of the ideas that came forth from one of the FM stations, and they brought up some thoughts about tab fees changing, sound transit, gun laws, and the revenue issue. We go through those a little bit to talk about how those, those are big ticket items from their perspective. What do they mean to the city of Tacoma?
Well, we know there's going to be some changes to a couple of things the voters voted on. One was the sweeping gun rights ordinance that the voters approved. There's probably going to be some tweaks to that necessary, because that happens frequently with initiatives. It's tough for legislators to do a whole lot, because once an initiative passes for 2 years, it takes a supermajority vote to change it. But there will be, I'm sure, some consideration. There's also the issue on deadly force by police officers that voters approved a while back. The legislature attempted to make some changes to that last session, and those were overturned by a court decision because of the way they did it. So we know that issue is also going to come back in 2019. The one that you mentioned that the City Council has taken a direct position on relates to Sound Transit. The voters in the region, and the press loves to say, by the way, that Pierce County voted against Sound Transit 3. Part of Pierce County did. Tacoma voted yes on Sound Transit 3, as Tacoma has done on all of the Sound Transit bond issues going forward. And so the Tacoma City Council's position on that is, okay, if there needs to be an adjustment to the car tabs and the way they're calculated because of the way Sound Transit used, the method they used, fine. But we want to make sure that what the voters in Tacoma voted for, the projects in Tacoma, still get funded properly as part of Sound Transit 3. And the major ones out of that was extension of Link Light Rail from SeaTac Airport to Tacoma Dome Station. That's the big one. The completion of the spine, so to speak, from Everett to Tacoma of Sound Transit light Rail. The other one, and a very important one, is bus rapid transit from downtown Tacoma out to Spanaway on Pacific Avenue. Ultimately to Spanaway. And that is also very important and something that's in the planning stage right now. We want to make sure those things happen. If they need to adjust that tab fee, Sound Transit still has to have the money to do those projects approved by the voters. And so it's going to be something we watch. The legislature's got a lot of people telling them about car tab fees and the way they're calculated. And there is debate about what formula you use.
Right.
But we have to make sure that they still have the money available to do what the voters asked them to do, because that did pass in the city of Tacoma. So that's that one. We expect that to take a lot of time, and that'll be one of the issues we mentioned earlier, that Representative Fye from Tacoma is going to be chair of the Transportation Committee in the House. That's going to be one of the issues that his committee will be dealing with significantly. So.
Now, you mentioned before that it's a 105-day session,
right?
And they don't have that big educational issue hanging over them anymore.
Yes, they do.
Oh, okay. All right.
Now they did meet the Supreme Court's decision on McCleary, the so-called McCleary case. Last session, they passed a major funding effort, directed billions of dollars more towards education, as the court asked them to do. However, like any time you do major policy upheavals like that, there's going to be things that have to be tweaked later, and what we fully expect the legislature will revisit some of that McCleary formula. We saw some examples where the Tacoma School District and other districts that are like Tacoma, which are older districts that are slower growing than some others. The way the formula was calculated, which is well beyond my understanding, kind of penalized those kinds of districts. So there'll be some adjustments to deal with that. And other factors regarding McCleary, might be some things regarding class size, and might be some things regarding building costs and transportation costs and other things as well. They're not done with it. They made the major step last session, but this is sort of the cleanup that they'll have to do in 2019.
Sure. Well, and they try to do the legislation so it helps the majority, and then they have to do some tweaks to help the rest.
Right.
So one other thing I wanted to get at before we leave the state legislative picture is in years past we've seen the extended time after the session was over. What's the forecast on the potential of that?
I don't think there shouldn't be one when you have one-party control with large majorities in both the House and Senate. You shouldn't need extra time. You should be able to get everything through on both sides. You know, there are still dynamics, even though you have Democrats in control of both the House and the Senate. The House and the Senate are very different bodies, and the old joke that used to be that if you're a Democrat, the Republicans are the opposition, the Senate is the enemy, or the House is the enemy, and vice versa. You can change those around, who's ever in charge. Because they approach things differently. There's 98 members of the House elected every 2 years. There's 49 members of the Senate elected every 4 years. The Senate has certain powers that the House doesn't have. They do confirmation of the governor's cabinet appointees, for example. So there's differences between the two. Representative Steve Kirby was recently on my show and complained that sometimes the senators think they're the only ones actually in Olympia. Olympia, and that there's not another side to that building. So the tensions between the two bodies can be apparent even when they're controlled by the same party, because they have different goals, different interests, different makeups, and they operate differently. You can go watch the House crank through vote after vote after vote with their electronic machine, in a relatively short period of time, or if you go over to the Senate, things are much more leisurely about that. They do the oral roll call vote. It takes a lot more time for the Senate to do stuff, and that's just deliberately the way they're set up.
Well, you mentioned political tension, so let's change our focus here to a much more politically tense environment in the nation's capital. And right now we're undergoing a government shutdown at the federal level, and it's affected people right back here in Washington as well as around the nation, and probably, for that matter, around the world. When you look at it from the city of Tacoma's perspective, what's your take on where we're going?
The City Council does adopt a federal agenda as well as a state agenda. It's a little different because of the way the Congress works versus the way the state legislature works. Congress is in session for the entire year, where the legislature is in session for a fixed period of time. We introduce bills at the state level. We generally don't do that at the federal level, and they don't do earmarks anymore at the federal level, which is one way we used to have direct influences in D.C. So, given all that, yes, but one issue that the shutdown is occurring over is immigration, and that is an important part of the City of Tacoma's legislative agenda. The City Council is in disagreement with the current administration regarding immigration. Whether it's the separation of families at the border, whether it's the treatment of folks who come here seeking asylum, whether it's the existence of a privately operated immigration jail in the City of Tacoma, all of those things are part of the agenda that the council adopted in 2018 for going forward to things that we would like to see addressed in 2019. Now, given the division in government between democratically controlled House, Republican-controlled Senate, and a Republican president, who's kind of made immigration and a wall, key to his presidency, we don't expect a lot of progress on the City Council's agenda unless there just happens to be certain opportunities that come along. And we will have an opportunity there that we didn't have before. And that is, Tacoma is unique in Washington State. We're the only city in the state who's represented by 3 members of Congress. Set aside our 2 senators, 5 altogether if you include the senators. But we have 3 members of the House who represent Tacoma. And Congressman Kilmer has the largest section, but Congressman Adam Smith is our longest serving member who's represented Tacoma. And then Congressman Denny Heck also represents a portion of Tacoma, as well as large portions of southern Pierce County and Thurston County. And so we have 3, and that's kind of great to have the one city that has 3 folks who pay some attention to what Tacoma's interests are. And when they're in the majority, that's better than being in the minority. They're all effective congressmen. They work well with others, and so they're able to get things done when they're in the minority, at least make their voices heard and their views heard. But when you're a member of a legislative body, it's always better to be in the majority party than the minority party, because you control the agenda and then what actually happens. So that's good for Tacoma to be able to at least give a little more voice, an effective voice towards these issues on immigration. But again, there's still the Senate, there's still the president, so we have to work through this process. And I don't know, here in January, what we might expect to see later in the year regarding the issues of immigration or some of the other ones that we care about.
Right. Now, the government shutdown obviously is a tough topic. It's you've got both sides of the political arena, facing off, and the president holds the veto power and or the signing power, as it might be. So there's really no way to forecast until they get to the table what might happen.
Right, and the sad thing though is that in recent years we've seen a situation where shutting down the government becomes a tactic, and that's just wrong on a number of levels. It's throughout the history of the United States, the political parties have had disagreements with one another and have had different control of the House and the Senate, and have had, or the Congress is in a different party than the president. You can have disagreements and work them through in reasonable ways. You can even get really mad at each other and work things through, but you don't shut down the government as a tactic to get your way. I mean, I'm sorry, that's just wrong, because that government provides services to people who are innocently caught up in the tempers that we're seeing in D.C. And ironically, the department that is most charged with the issue of immigration was one of the ones affected by the shutdown over immigration, which boggles the mind. And I just strongly disagree. And this is the government relations officer's personal opinion, that shutting down the government is ever a solution to what is essentially a political problem.
Well, and also to make people work and not pay them.
Right.
I mean, and now we've heard, like, the first, and at least the first to our knowledge, TSA agent for at CTAC has quit because they just don't want to work with no pay at the moment. And understanding that in most cases or all cases they get a bulk check once the government opens again or is funded again, they get their pay. But you know, during the time when they're working now and they don't have the money, if they didn't have savings, they're probably in some hot water.
And what damage is being done to the public's property? I mean, we know the national parks are closed.
Yeah.
The museums are closed. Yet we can't always keep folks out of the national parks because they don't have walls around them, or fences in many cases, and damage is being done to them. And that's I'm sorry, that's your property and my property and everybody else's property, and people don't have the right to go in there and chop down trees or do other damage to the lands of the public, and because we're not paying the rangers to be there on their jobs, damage is being done to public property. And that's, again, this gets down to this relatively recent in American history tactic of shutting the government down to get your way. It shouldn't be allowed to continue because by rewarding it as a success. It needs to be brought to an end.
Sure. Now, when we were talking about state government, we talked briefly about the Puyallup River Bridge and how there was funding for a portion of it, and now there's not funding maybe for the rest of it, we're hoping.
Right.
But when we have a big issue like that, is it kind of a bifold look? Do we look to the state to see if there's transportation dollars? We also look to the federal government for transportation dollars?
Well, we certainly do receive federal money passed through the federal government. Usually that comes through a regional process through the Puget Sound Regional Council, which hands out federal transportation dollars as well as some state dollars. So that's the mechanism for that. There's also direct appropriations that you can do with through the budget process in DC. Those take a little bit longer. To date, we have been looking for grant money, some of which has got federal money in part of the grants to do the Puyallup River Bridge. But when you're talking about a bridge with a problem that exceeds $100 million, it's hard. None of those grant programs provide grants that big.
Right.
They provide grants of maybe 10 to 15 to 20 million dollars, and it takes the piece of the bridge that we've been working on right now that the public is seeing being rebuilt. It took over 10 years to piece together the money through various grants to do that. Wow. It took so long that some of the earliest grants we were in danger of losing because we hadn't spent them yet in order to accumulate the money. That's the problem that we have to address, and we're hoping the legislature will address, that there are other bridges like this that just don't fit into our normal grant programs. And yet that bridge has 30,000 cars a day drive on it. It's a heavily used corridor. It's not just something we can close down and divert traffic elsewhere, because the only other place to divert it to is I-5, which has got its own problem.
Right, right, exactly. So when you look at the federal agenda, what are the key things that we're focused on, the council's focused on?
Immigration, clearly.
In addition to that,
number one. The other one that we're concerned about is funding that helps with programs that we really depend on here. And the number one issue there, well, there's actually two I'd put up at the top level. One is tax exempt bonds. Government bonds have always traditionally been tax exempt. They're a good thing for us, way to encourage that the city makes capital improvements, good things for people to invest in, because the government-backed bonds are usually very reliable and very attractive. But there's been attempts over the past to take away the tax exemption status of those bonds. We're very concerned about that. That's part of our agenda. The other one is the Community Development Block Grant, which is a program that goes back to President Nixon and has been a very successful program across the country where local governments, through some formula, get an allocation of money that can go towards direct human services and housing programs. We've seen that program wither over a long period of time until the stimulus program under the Obama administration, when it was boosted significantly, and then has begun to decline again. We're continually asking Congress to put money back into that program. There is not one that we can think of that we can better chronicle the improvements it's made in a community. This is direct appropriation money back to the community for human services and infrastructure that makes people's lives better. And so the Community Development Block Grant, or CBDG, is vitally important and always a major part of our agenda.
Sure. Now, unlike the state government down in Olympia that's now democratically controlled with a Democratic governor, the federal legislative system it's different. I mean, the Republican president, and now it'll be a Democratic-controlled House and a Republican Senate.
Right.
So, how does that, and for those that don't understand it, how does it affect the ability? I guess we're seeing part of it right now, but that actually occurred even before. The proposals and the government shutdown occurred before the change now to the democratically controlled House. How's that going to affect life going forward at the federal level?
Well, the split government and the split government from the administration to the Congress as well, it just makes it more difficult to achieve, but it's not impossible. Like I mentioned, even at the state level, when we've had split controls of legislatures or split controls between the administration and the legislature, it changes what you ask for and how you ask for it, and what members you might want to use and who's the right one to advance that. But it's possible to get things done in regardless if you have good issues and you approach it right. And we try very hard we respect people who have different positions than the City of Tacoma's adopted position on an issue. Certainly can respect that and not ask a member to do something that they clearly can't do. But if there's so we'll find another issue that they can work with us on. So there's ways to deal with this. Congress, when they did away with earmarks, which was a member's ability to put some money in a budget for a specific project in their district, that changed a lot of the dynamic, because even if you had policy disagreements, you could still work on budget issues regarding some spending in your district. We'd like to see them go back to that, because we think that the federal government investing in infrastructure in communities is a good thing, because infrastructure creates jobs and makes lives better. There clearly needs to be some guidelines as to what you're funding and what you're not funding, and because there were clearly, everybody can point to egregious abuses of bridges to nowhere and things like that. But I think with the right guidelines, that kind of stuff can be taken care of. So I'm encouraged every time I hear that there's some discussion of returning earmarks, because even when you're managing a legislative body, if you're Speaker Pelosi or you're Majority Leader McConnell, if you have budget items that you can work with your members to get their votes on things, it makes it easier to do the management of your operation if you're trying to run a legislative body. So hopefully they'll go back and recognize that there's value in doing some kind of earmark with the right kind of guidelines about how it's spent, that we could see Congress go back to what was a pretty effective way of managing. And by the way, we didn't have government shutdowns when they were doing that either. So I think that's something that they need to look at in terms of management of the federal Congress.
One other question related to the federal before we move on, but we're now 2 years into the Trump presidential term. How does that change things as we head towards the latter half of the 4-year term?
Well, I think one thing that we might see here in Washington that it might do is there's lots of rumors about our governor, looking at running for president. That would be unique to Washington State for a long time. I think there was some rumors once upon a time about former Governor Evans, running for president at once upon a time. I don't know if he ever had those ambitions, but there were people talking about him way back then. Governor Inslee got a lot of national attention because he was the president of the Democratic Governors Association. So his role in that job was to travel around the country and help elect more Democratic governors. And so he was, in a lot of large states, a lot of media markets, talking about candidates for governors in those states. And he's a good TV personality. He comes across well. He's very passionate about his issues like climate change and the role government can play in dealing with that. So whether he's going to make that personal decision to make that commitment to do that or not, I don't think it'll affect us during this legislative session, because the legislative session should be over by April, and that, the people who are going to run for president will be making their announcements between now and middle of the year. We've already seen a couple Democrats announce that they're going to run. Mm-hmm. I think the governor has plenty of time to not let that ambition, if he has it, get in the way of the legislative session.
Great. Well, let's change from the federal to the local now and talk about City Council for the last few moments here.
Okay.
With elections coming this fall, there will be members up for re-election and 2 being termed out. What does that mean for the council policy making? And tell us a little bit about the rumor mill and who we've heard that might be going where or what.
Well, there's always an election. There's always, we just finished this major federal election in 2018. 2019, odd-numbered years are municipal elections in Washington State. And so, yes, there are city council elections coming in November of 2019. And we have a 9-member city council, and 2 of those members, there are 4 members up whose terms are end in 2019, and 2 of those members are termed out because the city council has term limits of 2 terms, and so Councilmember Mello and Councilmember Ibsen cannot run for re-election again. So those seats, which Mello's is a citywide seat. And Ebsen's, is the District 1 seat, which is the west end of Tacoma, some of the north end. And so those seats will be vacated. And then there's 2 incumbent council members who will, I'm assuming, run for re-election, Councilmember McCarthy and Councilmember Blocker. And McCarthy is a citywide seat, and Blocker is a district seat. And so those seats will also be up. There's one name that I think is on everybody's list of who might be running, and that's a person who was just recently on the city council as the replacement to Councilmember Robert Toms when he was serving in the nation in Afghanistan for 6 months, and that's Justin Camerata, who I think grew to kind of like the job of city council and may be a candidate for the citywide seat that's coming up. But I think there's a lot of other folks that may be running for both the district and citywide seats. There's a lot of interest, especially district seats when they're open, because you don't have to raise as much money, you don't have to doorbell in as many places in a district seat. But I don't think anyone's going to doorbell as much as Councilmember Ibsen did anyway. He was notorious for visiting every house in his district 4 times on his 2 campaigns that he ran. And then he, I think, runs between the houses when he's going. He's a relentless doorbeller. So you don't have as much of that when you're in a district seat. You don't have to raise as much money. Citywide is a different animal. It's like running for mayor. I mean, it's just the same. You got to cover the entire community. So it'll be interesting to see what happens this fall. And it does change at 4 members, 2 brand new ones. Changes the dynamic a little bit for the city council, but that's the advantage of local government. You always get new folks.
Great. Well, with that, Randy, we've run out of time, and I want to thank you for your 28 years of service to the city of Tacoma and your pending retirement this year. And it's been a pleasure working with you, and look forward to seeing you on Inside Tacoma.
All right. Thanks, Jim.
All right. And thanks again for watching today's edition of CityLine. Hopefully Amanda will be back next Thursday, and please join us again. Take care, everybody. Oh, that's good.
Cool.